Hi, and welcome to Home Fashions U Sewing Online. I'm Angie Knowles with the free basic class on sewing machine feet, demonstrating how to use some of the extra feet that came with your machine. In this class, you will learn to use the binding foot. The binding foot is used to apply narrow decorative binding to your sewing projects. The finished width of the binding will vary from 1/4 to 1/2 inch depending on your particular foot. Before we get started sewing, I want to show you a close-up of the binder foot and point out a few features. This slot is where the bias strip is fed through, and it is rolled around both directions to form the folded edge. This slot is where the fabric to be bound is fed through. And back here, there's this little knob that can be pushed in and out to adjust how close to the folded edge I stitch. Now that's just one binder foot. Here's another one that I have. It's pretty much the same, except for it has these two little pins here that you feed the bias strip through to help guide it evenly. Now your foot may look differently, but it should have the same features. I recommend that you study your instruction manual that came with your foot and familiarize yourself with the different features that your foot has. Next up, I'll show you how to bind a straight edge and then later a curved edge. Now I recommend before you start on your project that you do a test sample using the same fabric that you'll be using for your project, just to see what type of adjustments you need to make. Before you get started, you'll want to trim one edge of the bias strip into a long point like this. And then we're going to take and feed that point into the bias binder. I like to use a stiletto to help me do this. This is the most awkward part, getting that fed through that binder. After you get it fed through so far, I like to take some needle nose pliers and help pull it through. You want to pull it gently because that pointed edge is quite fragile and will tear off if you try to pull it too hard. So I'm just pulling a little bit at a time until I can get enough through to pull it back under the foot. Okay. Now I'm going to take my fabric and slide it back and forth through the slot until I get it nice and tight up against that edge. I'm going to adjust my little attachment until I'm stitching close to the edge but not over it. Now take a few stitches. Okay, I need to go back just a little bit the other way because I'm stitching off the edge of the fabric or off the edge of the binding. So I'm going to push that over just a little bit. And this is one reason why you want to do a test with your fabric before you jump right into your project. Make all these adjustments on your test piece. Okay, that looks pretty good now. So I'm going to just keep sewing. I do have my stitch length set for a long stitch. It just helps everything feed through easier. And we're coming up on a seam in my bias. I went ahead and put a seam in it because occasionally you have to put seams in it. You do want to press it open, and then you want to trim off these little extra points. They'll just get in your way and cause you a lot of headaches. We'll trim those off. As that seam goes through the binder, you may have to give it a little extra help because it will want to bind up. Bind up, that's a joke. Okay, I'm having to give it a little bit of extra tug to get through. Really having to give that a tug. A little tough going over that seam, and that's a good reason to try to make your bias strips as long as possible. And you want to make sure your bias strips are cut as evenly as possible, a consistent width throughout, because if you have one area that's just a little smaller, and I know this one isn't cut straight, you're going to have some problem areas, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, you can see this area here where it did not fold over, and most likely my bias strip was a little narrow in that area. The rest of it looks pretty good. It doesn't even look too bad over that seam, although I had a very difficult time pulling that seam through. Okay. Overall, I say this looks pretty good. Of course, I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can see, but in reality, you'd be using a matching thread, and this will look very good. Just a couple areas to go back and fix where it didn't fold over. Next, let's take a look at doing a curved edge. Okay, let's do a curved edge. I'm going to feed my bias strip through the binder again. As I said, this is probably the most difficult part of this whole thing, is getting that strip fed through there. I think last time I got lucky and it didn't give me much trouble, but this time I'm not going to be so lucky. See if I can grab it with the pliers. Here we go. Okay, just took a little longer this time. Okay, so now I'm going to feed my fabric through the slot. Slide it back and forth, feeding it in. Lower my foot and my needle. When you're doing inside curves, you want to try to straighten the fabric out so it's in a straight line with the needle. Just take it slow. Outside curves are not much different from a straight area. Getting ready to go into an inside curve again. When you're straightening out that curve, you don't really want to pull on it because you don't want to stretch it out of shape. So let's take a look. On an inside curve, it looks pretty good. An outside curve, that's looking good. All in all, I say this curve looks pretty good. Thank you for watching this free class on the binding foot. While this foot does take a little practice to get the hang of it, I'm sure that once you do, you'll find many uses for it in your sewing. Be sure and check out the other free classes in the Sewing Machine Foot series. I bet you find something useful. For Home Fashions U, Sewing Online, I'm Angie Knowles.